Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Eagle Eye Apache. Today, we return to the razor's edge of Sawtooth Ridge. It is a place where joy walks hand in hand with danger, where death is always a whisper away, but where the fierce belief in a new life anchors the soul to this world, refusing to let go. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The sound of hoofbeats fading into the timber. It is a cruel sound, isn't it? It tricks the ear. It hangs in the thin mountain air long after the rider is gone, making you hold your breath, making you hope that the rhythm might slow, might stop, might turn around. But the rhythm didn't stop. It only grew fainter, swallowed by the vast, indifferent throat of the wilderness. Mercy stood on the rough-hewn planks of her porch, her fingers gripping the railing so tight, her knuckles turned the color of old bone. The dust Gideon's horse had kicked up on the deer trail hung suspended in the late afternoon sun, golden motes dancing in the light before slowly settling back onto the pine needles. And then, the silence returned. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning. It was a heavy, physical weight. Just hours ago, this ridge had been a battlefield. It had been loud with the crack of rifles, the shouts of mercenaries, and the terrifying, ancient whistle of Apache arrows. It had been full of him, his massive frame filling the doorway, the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his coat, the deep rumble of his voice that made the very floorboards vibrate. Now, the emptiness felt vast. The wind came down from the north, whistling through the spruce trees with a low moan. It touched her cheek, and it felt cold. The warmth of the summer was bleeding away, and the long shadows of autumn were stretching their fingers across the valley floor. A lesser woman might have collapsed. A lesser woman might have sunk to her knees and let the tears come, hot and blinding, to wash away the terror of the ambush and the heartbreak of the departure. But Mercy was not a woman built for collapsing. She was built of the same stubborn timber as her cabin. She had survived the White Eater blizzard. She had survived the loneliness of widowhood. She would survive this. She stood rigid, her gray eyes dry and fierce, scanning the tree line where he had vanished. She refused to weep. Tears blur the vision. And on the frontier, you cannot afford to be blind. Not even for a second. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her hand from the cold railing to her stomach. The cotton of her dress was worn, but the life beneath it was brand new. The swell of her belly was warm against her calloused palm. She waited, and there it was, a tiny, muffled kick, a flutter against her hand, a second heart, beating a strong, rhythmic drum in the silence of the mountain. This was the tether. This was the unbreakable chain that stretched from her womb, through the dense, dark timber, across the roaring rivers, all the way to the man riding into the shadows. He wasn't just a marshal anymore. He wasn't just a fugitive. He was a father. She replayed his voice in her mind, louder than the wind. I will return before our child's first cry is heard. It wasn't a wish. It wasn't a hope. It was a contract. It was a vow sworn on blood and scarred flesh. Mercy lifted her chin. She turned her back on the empty trail and looked at her cabin. Her fortress, the fire had burned down to embers. But she would not let it go out. She would stack the wood high. She would keep the light burning in the window, a beacon for the wolf when he finally turned for home. The dream wasn't over. It was just holding its breath. The days that followed Gideon's departure were curious things. You might expect them to be heavy with loneliness, dragging their feet like a tired mule. And in the beginning, perhaps they were. But as the gold of summer began to rust into the deep bronze of autumn, the rhythm of life on Sawtooth Ridge shifted. Mercy returned to her chores, but she no longer walked the trails alone. She rode. Before he vanished into the timber, Gideon had left behind a gift. Not a trinket, and not a letter. He left a horse. It was a zebra dun, a creature of the high plains, with primitive stripes marking its legs and a coat the color of dried wheat. It wasn't like the plow horses Mercy was used to. This animal moved differently. It placed its hooves with a deliberate, silent intelligence. It didn't spook at the scent of bear or the crack of lightning. It was an Apache war pony, trained to be as still as a stone, until the moment came to be the wind, when Mercy sat astride that horse, feeling the powerful muscles shifting beneath the saddle. She felt a strange sense of connection. It was as if the animal was a conduit, as if, through the heat of the horse's skin, she was holding Gideon's hand. But it wasn't just the horse. As the weeks went by, Mercy began to notice changes. It started small. So small, she thought her pregnancy brain was playing tricks on her. One morning, she stepped out onto the porch, a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the morning chill. Intending to chop kindling for the stove, she stopped. There, stacked neatly beside the door, was a pile of dry birch. It wasn't just thrown there. It was stacked with military precision, the bark all facing out to shed the rain. Each log split, clean and true. She hadn't chopped that wood. She looked around the clearing. The mist was clinging to the pines, thick and gray. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded small against the vastness of the mountain. No answer, just the drip, drip, drip of the dew falling from the eaves. 2 days later, she opened her door to find a brace of pheasants hanging from a hook on the porch beam. They were already cleaned, field-dressed with a surgical skill that left no waste. A week after that, a basket of late-season berries, wrapped in cool, green fern leaves. Mercy realized she was living in a haunted house. But the ghosts were kind. She stopped calling out. She realized that whoever or whatever was out there didn't want to be seen. They were shadows. They were the wind in the needles. They were the snap of a twig 3 ridges over. She never saw a footprint. She never saw a face. But she felt them. When she walked to the creek to fetch water, she felt 1,000 benevolent eyes watching her back. When she slept at night, the silence of the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt guarded. It was a comfort. But it was also a mystery. Until the night the moon went dark. It was late. The wind had picked up, howling down the chimney like a lost soul. Mercy was in her rocking chair, sewing a tiny quilt, when the sound cut through the wind. Voices, rough, loud, unhidden voices. They were down in the ravine, near the old wagon trail. Men's voices, thick with drink and bravado. Scavengers, perhaps, or maybe stragglers from the mercenary company who had decided to circle back, thinking the wolf was gone and the sheep was left unguarded. Up there, a voice shouted, carried by the wind, "See the light, that's the widow's place." Mercy froze. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood blossoming on the fabric. She blew out the lantern instantly, plunging the cabin into darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, terrified rhythm. She reached for Gideon's rifle, the cold steel heavy in her hands. She moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. Down in the darkness, she saw the flicker of a torch. They were coming up the trail. Gideon is gone, she whispered to her unborn child. We have to be brave. She cocked the hammer. Click. But then, something happened. The shouting down in the ravine suddenly stopped. It didn't fade away. It was cut off. There was no gunfire. There was no explosion. Just a sudden, swift thwip, like the sound of a heavy branch whipping through the air. Then a stifled cry. A sound of surprise. Then a dull thud, like a sack of grain hitting the earth. Then another cry. This one filled with terror, silenced almost as quickly as it began. The torchlight down on the trail jerked wildly, spun in the air, and fell into the dirt, extinguishing instantly. And then, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Mercy stood at the window for an hour, the rifle shaking in her hands. She waited for the boots on the porch. She waited for the door to be kicked in, but nothing came. The wind settled. The crickets began to chirp again, reclaiming the night. The next morning, as the sun burned the mist off the ridge, Mercy rode the painted horse down the trail. She had to know. She reached the spot where she had seen the torchlight. She gripped the reins tight, prepared for a gruesome sight. But there were no bodies. The earth had been swept clean with pine boughs. The forest floor looked undisturbed, innocent, but the Apache leaves signs for those who know how to look. Mercy dismounted. She knelt in the dirt. There, caught on a briar bush, was a hat. A greasy, battered felt hat that belonged to a white man, a scavenger. And beside it, in the dirt, a single, dark smear of dried blood. A drag mark led away from the trail, disappearing into the deepest, darkest part of the timber, the spirit lands. Mercy stood up. She looked into the dense trees. She didn't feel fear. A strange warmth flooded her chest, displacing the cold morning air. She finally understood. The critics in town said Gideon had abandoned her. They said he had run away to save his own skin. They didn't know the man, and they certainly didn't know the chief. He hadn't left her defenseless. He had turned the very forest into her armor. He had left behind an army of shadows, silent and lethal, with orders written in blood. Protect the queen. Mercy placed a hand on her belly and smiled at the empty trees. Thank you, she whispered. And high above, in the canopy of an ancient pine, a hawk cried out once, sharp and clear, before diving away towards the north. Miles to the north, far beyond the reach of the silent guardians and the comfort of the cabin. The world was not gentle. Here, the land did not whisper. It screamed. Gideon was crossing the threshold of what the Apache called the place of jagged teeth, a stretch of canyons and granite spires where the wind howled through the rocks like a dying animal. He was alone. The entourage of warriors had split off days ago to draw the pursuit away, leaving the wolf to find his own way back to the den. But the wolf was wounded. The bullet from the mercenaries' rifle was still lodged deep in his thigh, nestled against the bone like a nugget of burning coal. Every time his horse's hoof struck the hard limestone, a shockwave of agony shot up his leg, exploded in his hip, and rattled his teeth. It was a white-hot, blinding pain that turned the edges of his vision gray. A normal man would have fallen days ago. A normal man would have slid from the saddle, curled into a ball in the shade of a mesquite bush, and waited for the buzzards But Gideon was not a normal man. His physique was a map of survival: broad shoulders, built from years of swinging a hammer, a chest deepened by the thin air of the high country, and a will forged in the fires of two different worlds. His heart pumped blood like a steam engine, forcing life through a body that was begging to shut down. But even iron bends if you heat it enough. And the fever was the heat. It started as a shiver, a cold sweat that plastered his shirt to his back despite the midday sun. Then it became a fire. His skin burned. His mouth tasted of copper and ash. The landscape around him began to warp. The cactus appeared to twist into the shapes of men. The shadows stretched out like black fingers trying to drag him off the horse. He checked the sun. It was a blistering white eye staring down at him, judging him. "Keep moving," he rasped, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. "Not yet. Not yet." He fumbled at his saddle horn. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. He knew what was coming. He knew that soon his mind would snap, and his body would go limp. And if he fell here, in this unforgiving waste, he would never rise again. He pulled a length of rough hemp rope from his saddlebag. With clumsy, numb fingers, he lashed his wrists to the pommel. He tied the knots tight, cruelly tight, biting into the skin. He bound his good leg to the stirrup. He was lashing himself to his fate. He closed his eyes for a second, just to escape the glare of the sun. In the darkness, behind his eyelids, he saw her. He saw Mercy standing on the porch, her hand on her belly. He saw the gray of her eyes, clear and cool like mountain water. "I will return before the first cry," the promise echoed in his skull, louder than the ringing of the fever. It was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. It was a chant, a prayer, a war cry. One more mile, one more ridge. For her, for the child. He kicked the horse. The animal, sensing the desperation of its rider, surged forward. But the body has limits that the soul cannot negotiate with. An hour later, the sky began to spin. The red rocks of the canyon walls started to bleed into the blue of the sky. The sound of the wind changed. It sounded like voices. It sounded like his father. It sounded like the rattle of a snake. Gideon tried to lift his head, but it weighed 1,000 pounds. The strength that had allowed him to lift beams and break chains finally evaporated. The fever surged, a tidal wave of darkness crashing over him. His grip on reality loosened. He slumped forward. The rope held him for a moment, cutting into his wrists, keeping him upright in a grotesque mockery of riding. But then, the horse stumbled on loose shale. The jolt was the final straw. The knot slipped. Gravity claimed its prize. Gideon slid from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. Dust billowed up around him, coating his sweat-slicked face. He tried to push himself up, his fingers clawing at the dry earth, trying to drag himself north, inch by inch. Mercy, but his limbs wouldn't obey. The sun dimmed, not because of clouds, but because his eyes were failing. The roar of the river in his ears faded to a hum. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the hawk circling high above. The bird looked blurry, like a smudge of ink on wet paper. The darkness came in from the edges, soft and cool. It offered an end to the burning in his leg. It offered sleep. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty sky. And then, the wolf of Sawtooth Ridge closed his eyes, and the silence took him. The darkness that swallowed Gideon did not lead to silence. It led to the past. The mind is a strange vessel. When the body is broken, when the fever burns away the present, the soul retreats to the places where the foundation was laid. The cold wind of the Sawtooth Mountains vanished, replaced instantly by the searing, dry heat of the southern borderlands. The smell of pine and snow was gone, choked out by the dusty scent of sagebrush and heated stone. In the dream, he is not 40 years old. He is not a marshal. He is not a husband. He is 8. He is small, lithe, and brown as a nut, moving through the chaparral with the silence of a ghost. The sun is a hammer here, beating down on the cracked earth, making the air shimmer and dance. To a stranger, this land is a furnace, a place of death. But to the boy, it is a garden. It is alive. He is tracking a collared lizard. He moves on the balls of his feet, his eyes locked on the tiny tracks in the sand. He holds a small reed snare in his hand. He is patient. He has all the time in the world. But the lizard is not the only thing moving in the brush today. The boy stops. His head tilts. The cicadas are screaming their static buzz in the mesquite trees. But under that sound, there is something else. A heavy, clumsy sound. The sound of a boot crushing dry twigs. The sound of labored, desperate breathing. The boy melts into the shadow of a boulder. He watches. A man stumbles out of the heat haze. He is a creature entirely out of place in this world. He wears a suit of fine gray wool, now stained with sweat and dust. He wears a stiff collar that seems to be choking him. He carries a brass instrument on a tripod over his shoulder, a surveyor's tool, but he drags it like a cross. This is Elias Thorne. Not yet a senator. Not yet the powerful man who would shape the West. Just a surveyor from the capital. Lost, dehydrated, and blinded by the arrogance of empire. He looks at the vast, empty land and sees lines on a map. He does not see the danger. The boy watches him with dark, curious eyes. He knows he should run. The elders have told him that the white eyes are dangerous, that they bring sickness and fire. But this man does not look dangerous. He looks like a child lost in the dark. Thorne stumbles toward the shade of a rock ledge, the very same ledge where the boy is hiding. The man is gasping. His face flushed a dangerous red. He drops his equipment with a clatter and reaches out a hand to steady himself against the stone. He does not see the shadow coiled in the crevice. The warning comes too late. Ch-ch-ch-ch. The sound is unmistakable. It is the sound of dry bones rattling together. The maraca of death. Thorne freezes. He looks down, but his city eyes are too slow. The diamondback strikes. It is a blur of motion, a whip-crack of muscle and scale. The fangs sink deep into the calf of the man's leg, right through the wool of his trousers. Thorne screams. It is a raw, jagged sound that rips through the desert silence. He flails backward, falling into the dirt, clutching his leg. The snake recoils, coiling again, its tail vibrating furiously, ready to strike a second time. The man is paralyzed by terror. He stares at the serpent as if it were the devil himself. He knows he is dead. He is miles from a doctor, miles from water, and the venom is already burning its way through his veins. But the boy does not know terror. He knows only the law of the desert. He moves. He does not run away. He launches himself from the rock. He lands between the man and the snake, a small whirlwind of motion. In his hand, A crude knife made of obsidian flashes in the sun. He doesn't hesitate. With a single, fluid motion, he severs the snake's head from its body. The coils thrash wildly in the dust. But the threat is gone. Thorn stares up at the savage child standing over him, gasping for air. "Help me," he whispers, his voice cracking. The boy looks at the man. He sees the fear. He sees the pallor spreading under the sunburn. He knows the white eyes are enemies. But he also knows the teachings of his mother. Life is a river. You do not dam the water unless you must. He drops to his knees beside the stranger. He works with a calm that defies his age. He takes the obsidian blade and cuts the trouser leg open, exposing the angry, purple puncture wounds. The flesh is already swelling. The man groans, trying to pull away. But the boy's hands are strong. He pins the leg down. He looks the man in the eye, a look of fierce command that says, "Be still." Then, he brings his mouth to the wound. He sucks the blood and venom, spitting the bitter, metallic mixture into the dust. He does it again and again, drawing the poison out before it can reach the heart. The man's eyes roll back in his head. He is fading. The boy works faster. He grabs a handful of red clay from the creek bed and mixes it with his own saliva. He chews a mouthful of sagebrush until it is a pulp. He packs the wound with the poultice cool mud to draw the heat. Sage, to fight the infection. He tears a strip from the man's own fine linen shirt and binds the leg tight. It is done, but the man cannot walk. And the sun is dropping. The coyotes will come with the moon. The boy stands up. He looks at the heavy, unconscious body of the intruder. He looks back toward his village. It is 2 miles over rough ground. He sighs, a small puff of air through his nose. He grabs the man's arms. He turns around, hoisting the heavy wrists over his small shoulders. He digs his moccasins into the dirt. He begins to drag. It is an agonizing journey. The boy is an ant carrying a beetle. His muscles burn. The man's boots carve twin furrows in the sand. But the boy does not stop. He finds a rhythm. Step, I pull. Step, pull. By the time they reach the camp, the sun has set. The fires are lit. The boy drags his burden into the circle of light and collapses. Chest heaving. The camp erupts. Warriors rush forward. Women grab their children. They see the suit. They see the pale skin. They see the enemy brought into their heart. A tall warrior, the war chief, steps forward. He draws his knife. His face is twisted in anger. He looks at the boy, then at the unconscious man. "Why have you brought this sickness here?" the war chief demands. He is a surveyor. He comes to steal the land. He should have been left to the snake. The warrior raises the knife to finish what the desert started. But the boy stands up. He is trembling with exhaustion. He is covered in dust and the stranger's blood. He barely reaches the warrior's waist. But he steps between the knife and the man. He spreads his arms wide. He looks up at the war chief, his eyes burning with a strange, precocious fire. "No," the boy says. His voice is high, but it does not waver. The camp falls silent. Even the dogs stop barking. To defy a war chief is madness. He was dead, the boy says, pointing to the man. The desert took him. The snake took him. He taps his own chest, right over his heart. "I took him back. I fought the snake. I drew the poison. I carried him." He looks at the elders sitting by the fire. He speaks the words that will seal his fate. Words that invoke the deepest law of the tribe. The law of responsibility. He is not your enemy. The boy declares, "He is my kill, and because he is my kill, he is my life to save." The war chief pauses. He looks at the boy's fierce stance. He looks at the crude bandage on the white man's leg. He sees the spirit of a warrior in the body of a child. Slowly, the chief lowers the knife. He nods, a gesture of grudging respect. "Then he is yours, little wolf." The chief grunts. "You feed him, you watch him, and if he bites, you bleed." The memory fades. The image of the boy standing over the man dissolves into the swirling darkness. But in the fevered mind of the dying Gideon, the lesson remains. He saved the man who would one day become his father. He saved the enemy and made him family. He bridged the gap between the worlds once before. Step, pull, step, pull. In the cold canyons of the present, the unconscious Gideon's heart beats a little stronger. The boy inside him is still dragging the weight. He will not let go. Not then. Not now. The desert heals a man differently than a hospital. There is no smell of antiseptic. Only sage and sun-baked dust. As Senator Thorne's broken ribs knitted back together, something in his spirit began to fuse as well. He watched the Apache not through the sights of a rifle, but from the quiet corner of a shared fire. He saw how they moved with the land, not against it. He saw fathers teaching sons, mothers singing to the dawn. And with a soldier's instinct, he realized the terrifying truth: they were already ghosts. Thorne knew the maps back in Washington. He knew where the railroad lines were drawn in red ink. He knew that the Great Father's hunger for territory was a beast. These people, who had treated him with a mercy he did not deserve, were standing in the path of a tidal wave. They could not fight the coming flood with arrows and courage alone. They needed a dam. They needed a wall built of paper, laws, and politics. It was a cold night when Thorne sat the boy down. The firelight danced in Gideon's dark eyes that had seen too much death for one so young. Thorne didn't sugarcoat the world. He spoke of the capital not as a city of light, but as a jungle of stone. "You have the heart of a warrior," Thorne told him, his voice raspy with the dust of the plains. "But the war coming for your people cannot be fought with a knife. It is fought with words. It is fought with signatures in dark rooms. If you stay here, you die a hero. If you come with me, you might just live long enough to save them." He offered the boy a terrible choice: to forsake his freedom, to cut his hair, to wear the clothes of his enemy, and to learn the language of the conqueror. He offered him the golden cage. "Come with me," the old man said. "Learn the ways of the wolf in the stone city. Power is the only language they speak. If you want to save your people, you must become one of us." And Gideon, looking at the sleeping forms of his kin, accepted the burden. He extinguished the fire in his heart, or so he thought, and stepped into the carriage. He left the silence of the desert for the roar of the machine. The capital was a monster built of iron and steam. It was a cacophony of carriage wheels on cobblestones, the shrieking of train whistles, and the constant, low hum of commerce. To a boy raised under the infinite expanse of the stars, the city was a prison without bars, a labyrinth where men smiled while holding daggers behind their backs. Years bled into one another. The boy became a man. The wildness was pressed out of his clothes, tailored into sharp suits and stiff collars, but it never left his eyes. Under Thorne's tutelage, Gideon learned the law. He learned that justice was a commodity, bought and sold like grain. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the Senate floor as skillfully as he once tracked deer through the brush. He became a marshal, a badge of silver, pinned over a heart of iron. He was efficient, lethal. He hunted outlaws with a terrifying precision, becoming a legend in the newspapers, the civilized savage. They called him. A headline that tasted like ash in his mouth. But every outlaw he brought in, every judge he charmed, was a brick in the wall he was building to protect his home. Thorn, meanwhile, aged. His hair turned white, his movements slower, but his influence grew. He spent a decade crafting the peace treaty. It was his magnum opus, a document that would guarantee the Apache their land, their sovereignty, forever. It was a shield against the greed of the West. They were so close. The ink was ready. The hands were shaken. But the earth holds secrets. And secrets have a way of shattering dreams. It wasn't a scout who found it. It was a surveyor, deep in the territory marked for preservation. He saw the glint in the creek bed. Gold, not just dust, but veins of it. Thick, heavy, yellow veins running through the quartz like fat through meat. Gold changes the weight of a man's soul. It makes promises rot. The news didn't hit the papers. It hit the back rooms. The trusted allies Thorn had dined with for 20 years. The men who spoke of honor and duty suddenly went quiet. The calculation was simple. The treaty protected the land. The land held the gold. Therefore, the treaty had to die, and the man holding the pen had to be removed. The coup was silent and swift. There were no gunshots, only forged ledgers and whispered lies. They painted Thorn not as a peacemaker, but as a traitor selling state secrets. They framed him with the very corruption he had spent a lifetime fighting. Within a week, the senator was stripped of his title. The gavel came down like a guillotine. He was thrown into the dark damp of a federal prison, his reputation in tatters. The treaty shredded in the wind. But the conspirators had a problem. A loose end. Gideon, the marshal, was the only one who knew the truth of the land, and the only one with the skill to expose the rot. He was the last obstacle between the mining companies and the genocide of his people. The corrupt officials didn't want a trial for Gideon. A trial is public. A trial asks questions. They wanted him erased. They pooled their blood money and sent word to the shadows. They didn't hire lawmen. They hired the wolves. Mercenaries who didn't care about badges or borders. The order was simple. Find the marshal and make sure he never comes back to the capital. In the dank solitude of his cell, Senator Thorn felt the cold grip of failure. He coughed, his lungs rattling. Looking at the small square of light high on the wall, he knew they would come for the boy. He had brought Gideon into the wolf's den, and now the pack was closing in. He had one card left to play, one final act of the father he had tried to be. He bribed a guard with the last of his hidden coin, a gold watch, an heirloom of a life he no longer recognized. He passed a scrap of paper, smaller than a playing card, to a runner who knew the secret paths back to the desert. The message wasn't for the lawyers. It wasn't for the press. It was for the elders. It was a plea to the world he had once tried to destroy, asking them to save the thing he loved most. The runner vanished into the night, carrying words that would ignite a war. The message was short. The Alpha is in danger. The treaty is a lie. Bring him home. There is a silence that exists only in the spaces between heartbeats. a profound stillness where the soul decides whether to stay or to leave. For days, Gideon had floated in that gray river, in the fever dreams of his delirium. The steam whistles of the capital had screamed like dying birds, and the faces of the men who betrayed him twisted into demons made of gold and smoke. He had been running through a labyrinth of stone, bleeding out, the cold pavement sucking the heat from his bones. But then, the gray river slowed. The screaming metal faded. Consciousness did not return with a crash, but like a tide rolling in over smooth stones. The first thing was the scent. It was not the metallic tang of blood or the sulfur of the city. It was acrid, sweet, and ancient. It was the smell of the earth exhaling. Sage, sweet grass, the resin of pine burning on a low, controlled fire. Gideon opened his eyes. He was not in a prison cell. He was not in a hospital bed with starch-stiffened sheets. Above him, the structure of the lodge curved like the rib cage of a great beast. Hides stitched together to block out the world. The light was dim, flickering orange and gold, painting shadows that danced on the walls. Shadows that looked like ancestors watching, waiting. He tried to move. His body braced for the scream of nerves, the tearing agony of the wounds he had taken in the ambush. He expected the fire of infection. Instead, he felt a strange, throbbing heat in his leg. He looked down. The limb was not bandaged in white gauze, but bound in dark leaves and strips of leather. A poultice of river mud and crushed roots pulse against his skin, drawing out the poison, knitting muscle to bone, with a speed that defied the science of the white man. The pain was gone, replaced by a hum of energy, a vibration that seemed to match the rhythm of the earth itself. He was not alone. Sitting across the fire, wreathed in the thin smoke, were the guardians of his past. The ancient medicine woman sat cross-legged, her face a map of wrinkles so deep they looked like dry riverbeds. Her eyes were closed, her hands moving in a slow, rhythmic weaving motion over the smoke, chanting a song that had no words, only sound. She was pulling the broken pieces of his spirit back together. And beside her sat the old chief. He looked older than Gideon remembered. The winters had been hard. His hair was the color of snow on the mountain peaks, and his shoulders were bowed under the weight of a dying world. But his eyes, black, sharp, and unyielding, were as clear as a hawk's. He was watching Gideon with a look that was not pity, nor relief. It was recognition. Gideon pushed himself up. The movement was fluid, effortless. The heaviness of the city, the slump of the shoulders he had adopted to fit into the suits and the salons, had evaporated. He felt light, dangerous. He looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had signed warrants and held gavels. But they looked different in the firelight. They looked like claws. The chanting stopped. The medicine woman opened her eyes, dark pools of infinite depth, and nodded once. Her work was done. The old chief leaned forward, the firelight catching the silver around his neck. He did not ask how Gideon was. He did not ask about the politics of the capital or the betrayal of the senator. Those were trivial things. The shifting of dust in the wind. He spoke to the essence of the man sitting before him. "You are surprised," the chief said, his voice sounding like grinding stones. "You expected to wake up broken. You expected to die in the stone city." Gideon opened his mouth to speak, to explain the ambush, the gold, the framed senator. But the chief raised a hand. Silence fell again. heavy, and commanded, "The medicine does not just heal the flesh. My son, it burns away the false skin. You went to them. You wore their clothes. You spoke their tongue. You let them put a cage around your heart." The chief pointed a gnarled finger at Gideon's chest. "But the cage is broken now." Gideon looked down at the poultice on his leg, feeling the throbbing power of the earth moving through his veins. He realized he wasn't just healed, he was enhanced. The fever had burned away the hesitation, the fear of the law, the fear of propriety, the fear of crossing the line. It was all ash, the chief continued, his voice rising, resonating off the hide walls of the lodge. "You are stronger than me now. The physical pain of this world can no longer hold you. The pup who left is dead." The old chief stood up, his shadow stretched long and terrifying against the wall of the lodge. He looked down at Gideon, not as a superior, but as a witness to a transformation. "The alpha wolf has returned." The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke. The alpha wolf. For years, Gideon had tried to be two men. He had tried to be the civilized marshal, the uphold of the written law, the man who believed in the system. And he had tried to bury the Apache, the wild thing that knew the smell of rain before it fell and the sound of a heartbeat from a mile away. He had thought they were enemies, these two halves of himself. He thought he had to choose, but as the fire popped and the sage filled his lungs, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The senator was wrong. The chief was wrong. He wasn't one or the other. He was the alloy. He was the bridge. He looked at the chief. Gideon didn't just see an old man. He saw the history he was sworn to protect. And when he thought of the capital, he didn't just see corruption. He saw the target. He possessed the knowledge of the white man's law, the strategy of their generals, the layout of their cities. And now, he possessed the revitalized, unbreakable spirit of his ancestors. He knew how the enemy thought, and he knew how to hunt them. Gideon stood. He rose to his full height, the herbs shifting on his leg. He didn't wince. He felt the ground beneath his bare feet, connected, rooted. He took a breath, expanding his chest. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt the air actually fill him. He was not just a marshal anymore, and he was not just a warrior of the plains. He was the reckoning. He looked at the old chief, his eyes burning with a cold, blue fire that matched the heart of the flame. "Then let them come," Gideon whispered. "I know their law, and I know how to break it." The golden cage was open, and the wolf was loose. Gideon stood to his full height, and the lodge seemed to shrink around him. The air, previously thick with the scent of healing, now vibrated with a different energy. It started low, a thump in the chest, a tremor in the ground. It was the rhythm of blood pumping through a heart that had finally remembered its purpose. It was the sound of war drums, beating not on skin, but in the spirit. He looked at the old chief, and for the first time, there was no deference in Gideon's eyes. Only the shared understanding of soldiers on the eve of battle. The fever had burned away the politician. The pain had cauterized the doubt. Gideon was done negotiating. He was done with the gavel and the pen. Outside, the wind howled through the canyons, carrying the scent of rain and iron. Somewhere out there, the mercenaries were still closing in, checking their rifles, confident in their numbers, arrogant in their belief that they were hunting a wounded bureaucrat. They believed they were the predators. They were wrong. Gideon reached down and took a handful of ash from the fire, streaking it across his chest, a badge older than any tin star. He was no longer running away from the capital. He was pivoting. The map in his mind changed. The valleys were no longer escape routes. They were kill zones. The shadows were no longer places to hide. They were weapons to wield. But before the hunt could begin, there was one tether that still held him to the light. One anchor in the storm. His thoughts flew outward, faster than the telegraph wires, soaring over the jagged peaks of the Sawtooths. Across the vast expanses of pine and shale, he closed his eyes, visualizing the porch, the summer heat. The woman who held the other half of his soul. He leaned into the dying embers of the sacred fire. His voice, a low growl that merged with the crackling wood. "Wait for me," he whispered, sending the words into the smoke. "The storm is coming, but I am the thunder." Miles away, the air was heavy with the lazy heat of summer. Mercy stood on her porch, a basket of laundry in her hands. The world was quiet, save for the buzzing of cicadas. Suddenly, she stopped. The basket dropped from her hands. A wind swept up from the valley floor, not a cooling breeze, but a sudden, intense gust of warmth that hit her chest like a physical touch. It wasn't the sun. It was him. She gasped, her hand flying to her heart, feeling the echo of his promise vibrate through her ribs. The fear that had knotted her stomach for weeks unraveled, replaced by a fierce, burning certainty. He was alive, and he was coming. She looked toward the tree line, her eyes narrowing. The wind shifted direction, blowing the leaves back to reveal what had been hidden. From the deep shade of the pines, they stepped out, one by one, the invisible guardians. They wore no uniforms, only the colors of the forest. They carried rifles held low and ready. They did not speak. They did not need to. They looked at Mercy, and then they looked toward the mountains. The waiting was over. The defense of the ridge had begun. The winter tests the roots, freezing the earth to see what can survive the cold. But the fire burns away the dross to reveal the gold underneath. The golden cage has been shattered, and the wolf is on the prowl. Now, I want to hear from you down in the comments. What did you think of the betrayal? Did Gideon make the right choice, stepping out of the golden cage? Let me know your thoughts. And I always want to know, where are you tuning in from tonight? Are you driving through the night on the highway, sitting at your desk? Or are you out there by a campfire of your own? Drop your location below. Let's see how far the tribe stretches across the map. If this story sparked a fire in your spirit, go ahead and hit that like button. It keeps the signal strong. Share this video with a friend who needs to hear a real legend. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and ring that bell. You are not going to want to miss what comes next. The storm has gathered. The wolf is loose. Get ready for the explosive conclusion of the Sawtooth Ridge Chronicles in the next episode. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon.